Among the greatest Jewish thinkers and leaders of all time, Moses, the son of Maimon, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon, Rambam in Hebrew acronym, Musa ibn Maimon in Arabic, commonly Latinized as Maimonides, was a 12th century Sephardic Jewish philosopher, a leading expert in Jewish law and Talmud, the head of the Jewish community of Egypt, as well as an astronomer and physician. A master of both philosophy and science, law and logic, Maimonides, it may be fair to say, was one of the most prolific and influential scholars of the Middle Ages, and the greatest rabbi of the period, writing what may have just been the greatest code of Jewish law in all of Jewish history. Let us talk about his life, his work, and his legacy. Hey, what's up seekers? Welcome back. In this series, we're going to take a deep dive into Maimonides and his relationship with mysticism. People tend to think or speak about Maimonides as a rationalist philosopher who had no interest in mysticism or was even actively opposed to it. In this series, we're going to attempt to carefully question that assumption and ask, are rationalism and mysticism necessarily opposed to one another? What did Maimonides' rationalism consist of? What did he actually believe? What was his relationship with philosophical mysticism, Jewish mysticism, and Kabbalah? And what might we be able to learn from his philosophy today? This series is being produced in collaboration with two incredibly kind and brilliant educators, philosophers, and dear friends of mine, Dr. Justin Sledge from Esoterica and Philip Home from Let's Talk Religion. They're going to be releasing their own Maimonides videos a little down the line. I'll tell you more about that when the time comes. All I can say for now is that you should be very excited and go check out their channels immediately and subscribe if you haven't already. Alright, let us begin this series then by properly introducing the genius philosopher, Torah scholar and physician, the man whose books were banned and burned and went on to change the face of Judaism, Moses Maimonides. Maimonides was born to a distinguished family of learning and leadership on Passover Eve 1138 or 1135 according to some, in Cordoba, Spain, which at the time was under Almoravid Muslim rule, and was one of the great intellectual capitals of the world for both science, philosophy, and religion. Maimonides and his family were forced to flee the Iberian Peninsula on the heels of the fundamentalist Almohad invasion in 1148, and spent a decade plus on the run from religious persecution, stopping in Fez, Morocco in 1160, and eventually settling in Fostat, Egypt in 1166, after a brief stop in the Holy Land. Within a few short years, Maimonides was appointed Rais al-Yahud, the head of the Jewish community of Egypt. Following the tragic death of Maimonides' younger brother David, who was lost at sea while on a commercial venture, Maimonides suffered a year-long depression in his own description, and subsequently, to support both his and David's family, which David had been doing up until then, Maimonides took on the role of the personal physician to the Egyptian royal court of Saladin of the Ayyubid dynasty. In a now somewhat well-known letter from 1199 to his official translator Shmuel ibn Tibbon of Provence, Maimonides, responding to a request from Shmuel to visit him in Fostat to discuss some questions of philosophy and translation with him, Maimonides warns Shmuel against visiting, writing about his daily schedule, which began with a visit to the Sultan's palace to see to all the medical needs there, returning to a house full of, quote, Jews and Gentiles, nobles and common people, judges and bailiffs, friend and foe, all awaiting my return. Taking, Maimonides writes, a quick snack, his only meal of the day, before administering to the ailing crowd, prescribing treatments late into the night, deep into his exhaustion, until he could no longer speak. In this matter, writes Maimonides, I spent the day, and tells Ibn Tibbon not to expect even one moment of his time, neither by day nor by night, should he make the dangerous trip to Egypt. Let us turn then to Maimonides' work. During his lifetime, Maimonides established himself as an authority on a wide range of issues. Abraham Joshua Heschel once commented that if we didn't know better, one could be justified thinking that Maimonides was the name of an entire academy of scholars, not just a single individual. Maimonides' literary output seems to cover an impossibly wide scope of subjects. Maimonides was the first person to write a systematic code of all of Jewish law. He also wrote what is probably the greatest Jewish philosophical text of all time, along with a complete commentary on the Mishna and numerous other books on science and medicine. Just to briefly present some of his greatest literary achievements. The earliest work we have from Maimonides, written in his teens or early 20s, is a text of astronomy in which he calculates the intercalation of the calendar. followed not long after by his first philosophical work, his treatise on logic, Makalla fin Sanat al-Matik in Arabic, Milot HaHigaon in Hebrew, a work of 14 succinct chapters in which he lays out the essentials of Aristotelian logic as filtered through the great Muslim philosopher Al-Farabi. In addition to astronomy and logic, Maimonides wrote a series of influential books on medicine, and his findings about poisons and antidotes, preventative medicine, public hygiene, patient care, and the health of the soul, what we today would call mental health, went on to be published and taught for centuries to come. Turning to Maimonides' primary work as a rabbinic scholar and halachist, in 1168, after nearly a decade of labor, Maimonides completed the first full commentary on the Mishna ever written. The Arabic title was Kitab al-Siraj, the Book of the Lantern, a masterpiece which itself could have sufficed for one lifetime of scholarship. The commentary is particularly famous for its acclaimed introductions, including his introduction to Tractate Avot, an ethical treatise known as Shmona Prakim, the 8 chapters, as well as his introduction to the 10th chapter of Tractate Sanhedrin, known as Parak Chelek, an essay concerning the end of days and the afterlife, in which Maimonides enumerates his famous or infamous credo, the 13 Principles of Faith, which he believes every Jew must believe, the first ever attempt to systematically codify principles of faith in the history of Judaism, one which set off a controversy that persists until this very day. As well as a third famous introduction to the work itself, the Introduction to the Mishna, which discusses the nature of the oral law and its transmission throughout the generations, and the distinction between the Navi and the Chacham, the prophet and the sage, and the internal organizational structure of the body of the Mishnah itself. Maimonides' next great rabbinic work, completed in 1170, was his Sefer haMitzvot, the Book of the Commandments, a work still studied avidly today, in which he lists and discusses all 613 commandments prescribed by the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the 5 books of Moses. Then in 1180, Maimonides finished compiling his first true magnum opus, a work comprising of 14 books, which became known collectively as the Mishneh Torah, the repetition or the second Torah, which became one of, if not the premier work of Jewish law ever written, and throughout the centuries has remained a heavily studied work for students and scholars alike, as well as a vital guide for Jewish communities in practicing Jewish law, faith, and ritual throughout the ages. In this encyclopedic work of Jewish law, Maimonides aimed to organize the massively complex body of interpretation, elaboration, and argumentation into one highly systematic, clean, and orderly text, which he hoped would be the authoritative, definitive last word on the excruciating complex debates of Jewish law that had baffled even the greatest of Jewish geniuses before him. But oh, how delightfully wrong he was. The Jewish love for debate certainly did not end with Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. With this audaciously monumental work, in which Maimonides systematized the entire legal body of Judaism, Maimonides established himself as a rabbinic thinker for the ages. Maimonides, in what proved to be not too much of a rabbinic crowd-pleaser, writes in his introduction to this magnificent work that he intended with this text to give a complete and comprehensive statement of the law so that a practicing Jew would only need 2 books in their possession to know the law that they may do it. They were the written Torah, namely the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, and the Mishneh Torah, Maimonides' text, and nothing else. And oh, again, how delightfully wrong he was. The Jewish passion for book writing and halachic debate did not end with Maimonides' Mishneh Torah either. Maimonides strangely begins his halachic magnum opus not chronologically, as does the Mishnah or Yosef Cairo's Shulchan Aruch, but rather he begins logically, from first principles, with a discussion of theology, cosmology, and metaphysics. And so he opens the first of the 14 books of the Mishneh Torah, known as Sefer Mada, the Book of Knowledge, because he believes that it is a legal halachic obligation upon the Jew to come to a philosophically accurate belief concerning the existence and knowledge of God, and it is towards this end that he sees his entire halachic enterprise, and indeed his entire life, perhaps, even directed. If you thought this man was done, you'd be wrong. The next great work Maimonides produces, which establishes him as a thinker for the ages in yet another field, is his magnificent and baffling philosophical magnum opus, the Guide for the Perplexed, Dalalat al-Haririn in Arabic, Moreh Nevuchim in Hebrew. We're going to have a lot more to say soon about the guide, but for now we'll just give a brief introduction. Completed in 1190, the guide represents the full philosophical articulation of the mature Maimonides, a masterpiece which contains a rebuttal to biblical literalism and anthropomorphism, a severe rejection of divine corporeality, which he believed was tantamount to idolatry, an uncompromising defense of negative theology, an extended critique of Kalam thought, a systematic exposition of creation, prophecy, and providence, a theory of jurisprudence, and a masterful interweaving of Judaism with Neoplatonized Aristotelianism through the great Muslim translators, commentators, and interpreters of Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, and Ibn Rushd, amongst others. The guide, in what can only be seen as a supreme moment of philosophical, intellectual, and religious care and concern, was written in the form of a series of letters to a single student, a certain Yosef ben Yehuda, Joseph the son of Judah, who was torn between philosophy and Judaism, between what he saw as reason, science, and logic on the one hand, and faith, tradition, and God on the other. Maimonides' guide, intersecting Jewish, Greek, and Muslim thought, went on to be immensely influential in the history of Western philosophy for both Jewish, Muslim, and Christian philosophers, with almost every philosophical work for the remainder of the Middle Ages citing, commenting, or criticizing Maimonides' views, including some unexpected names like the Muslim mystic Ibn Hud and the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, and not to mention, of course, the great Thomas Aquinas. And even into the modern period, we find thinkers like Spinoza and Leibniz seriously engaging with the ideas presented in their guide and affecting and influencing their own philosophy. Maimonides' work was not only hugely influential, but also hugely controversial. It is likely that no other Jewish philosophical text elicited as much opposition as the guide. Almost immediately after its publication, many rabbis sought to ban the guide from their communities. It was particularly the rabbinic establishment of France who took umbrage with Maimonides' work, and went as far to turn it over to the Dominican authorities leading the French Inquisition at the time, who, in 1233, wasted no time hunting down and publicly burning copies of the text in a public square in Paris. It was just a few short years later when the Dominicans continued by burning 24 wagon loads of the Talmud in the very same square where the guide had been burnt. After watching the Talmud rise up in flames, Rabbeinu Yonah, a student of one of Maimonides' leading rabbinic opponents and himself a signature on the 1233 ban against the guide, Rabbeinu Yonah realized the mistake his side had made by involving the fire-happy Christian ecclesiastical authorities in internal Jewish theological disputes, and vowed to travel from France to the grave of Maimonides in Tiberias, northern Israel, to beg forgiveness by the feet of the man himself whose words he had sent to the Inferno. He only ever made it as far as Toledo. In addition to all of the above-mentioned works, Maimonides kept up busy correspondence with Jewish communities far and wide on a range of theological, pastoral, legal, and existential issues on pressing matters of both law and life. With these responsa, these truvot, the collected correspondence of Maimonides, a classic of rabbinic literature of the period, Maimonides extended his influence and responsibility to large swaths of world Jewry of his day and going forward. The most famous of Maimonides' letters include his Igeret Teiman, the letter to the Jews of Yemen, addressing the false hopes raised by a messianic contender amidst harsh religious persecution. Maimonides, in the letter, firmly dismisses this messianic figure and the signs purported to predict his arrival, while gently soothing their suffering and reassuring them back to the faith of their ancestors. Another is Maimonides' Maimer Tchiat HaMetim, his treatise on resurrection, in which he addresses concerns over his controversial theological and eschatological statements that he had made in the guide and the Mishneh Torah regarding resurrection and the afterlife. One last particularly poignant example of Maimonides' care and leadership, even from a young age, is his Igeret Hashmad, his letter on apostasy, written to Jews that found themselves under the oppressive rule of the Almohades, who were forced by sword to either convert to Islam or to flee, as Maimonides himself had been forced to not long before. In the letter, Maimonides addresses those Jews who chose to convert under duress, and wanted to know what their status was as Jews and whether they could return to their brethren in the Jewish community. Maimonides, a caring and brilliant leader in a difficult time, writes with compassion and courage, addressing all the concerns of his beleaguered brothers and sisters. What makes one an apostate according to Jewish law? Does forced conversion and transgression separate one from the religion of their mothers? Must one lay down their lives to sanctify God's name? And when, tragically, this was far from the last time in Jewish history where Jewish communities, men, women, and children, would have these questions forcibly put to them, and Maimonides' letter again and again stood as a source of guidance, comfort, care, and concern, a tower of solace to the broken and the bleeding. Maimonides stood by his people, by his flock, in the 12th century, in the 13th, the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, right up until today. On the 20th of Tevet, December 1204, Maimonides passed away in Egypt. It is believed that upon request, his retired body was taken to be buried in Tiberias. In the wake of their loss, Egyptian Jewry commemorated 3 days of fasting, and in the place of food, the terrible words from the prophet Samuel, Va'arin ha'elekim nilkacha, the ark of God has been taken, was upon their lips. Following his passing, Maimonides was recognized as one of the greatest Jewish scholars of all time, as both a staunch conserver of tradition and her daunting innovator, and over 800 years since his passing, his influence is felt in every field of Jewish thought. It is difficult to imagine a Judaism without his influence. Humans, struggling to come to terms with the greatness of this man amongst men, called him the Great Eagle and included his saintly name in their solemn Kaddish prayers. Maimonides may be fairly characterized as the most influential Jewish thinker of the Middle Ages and quite possibly of all time. With his Mishneh Torah, Maimonides takes a singular place as one of the foremost legal authorities in Jewish history, his voluminous work comprising a canonical cornerstone of any Jewish library, study hall, and legal ruling up until this very day. With his Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides cemented his name as the greatest of philosophical minds of the rabbinic tradition, if not of all of Judaism, and as the basis for all Jewish philosophical activity which follows him. Unlike his predecessor, whose tomb is not to be found, upon Maimonides is written the words, "From Moses to Moses, there arose none like Moses," meaning that from the Moses who led the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt to encounter God at Sinai, to Moses Maimonides, who from Egypt led his people out of the slavery of their own superstitions and fears to encounter the God beyond their understanding, none arose like Moses. Besides for being a lawyer, judge, jurist, Talmudist, posek, teacher and codifier of Jewish law, a physician, philosopher, political advisor, and scientist, more than all of these, as evident from his life and letters, Maimonides was a Jewish leader, a manheg Yisrael, a shepherd to a stubborn and tender flock, the Rais al-Yahud, the eyes of the community and the heads of thousands of Israel. It was to him that they turned, and to them who he gave his life and hung his soul in the balance. In next week's video, we're going to be asking the question, how many Maimonides were there? Looking at the many ways Maimonides has been perceived and received throughout time from the 13th century up until the 21st, with a focus on the debate about Maimonides' relationship to mysticism. I hope you enjoy. Thank you to our patrons who make this project possible. Their continued support is what allows us to continue this work. If you're enjoying the work as well and can afford it, please do consider supporting us. Until next time, catch you later and keep seeking.